Good morning. I'm Deb Myhoff with Communitas, facilitator for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Housing Actions Work Group. This is our fourth meeting this morning and will be a bit of a workshop very specific to the model code, as you have likely seen in your agenda already. Glad you all are here. Let me just do a quick rundown of our objectives out of the conversation this morning. I'll introduce the staff resources and team resources we have in the room, and then we'll get rolling quickly. This is a 2-hour meeting this morning, just a reminder. And so we're talking to you, as I just mentioned, about the model code, trying to get some shared understanding of the origin and purpose of this model code, and then also ground us in the themes and things we've already heard over the past couple of years, including in prior HOG meetings. As I mentioned, this will be sort of hopefully a little more casual. It's a lot of people in a virtual room, but we'll do our best to sort of treat this as a workshop for you all to review and provide feedback on the model code framework that was linked in the agenda packet, and how well that framework addresses the policy objectives and the statutory requirements. We'll also be exploring and discussing the functionality of the model code as an adoption-ready action to accelerate production, affordability, and choice. And then, of course, spending our time throughout, hi, Kitty, spending our time throughout highlighting opportunities to integrate the racial equity framework for decision-making. So with that, we will round up the meeting at the end talking about how well we did addressing those things, including the racial equity framework, and give you a view on what's ahead. Let me do a quick round of introductions of the team in the room, and then we'll get rolling. Sean, let's start with you in DLCD, please.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Edging. I'm the housing planner at the new Housing Accountability and Production Office. And I'll be kind of, helping navigate us through this model code discussion today. Yeah. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, Sean. Ethan?
Hey everyone, good morning. My name is Ethan Starkmeyer, I manage the housing division at DLCD, and I guess I'll go to Joel.
Good morning, everyone. Joel Madsen, Housing Accountability and Production Office Manager at DLCD.
Glad to have you here, Joel. Thea?
Hi, everybody. Thea Croman, Housing Planner with the division. In this role today, happy to just be sitting back and listening to what y'all come up with.
And if you're not paying attention to the full scheme, Michael and Thea's kitties are like moving in the same way. So it's pretty great to see you both. Celestina.
Sure, thanks. Good morning. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, also a housing planner here at the housing division at DLCD, working closely with Thea on a lot of this work. But again, Sean will be leading us today. Maybe over to Madi.
Morning, everyone. Madi Valencia Aguilar, share they pronouns, housing planner, supporting Thea and Sestina and following along in this work. So happy to be here. Maybe I'll pass it over to Miss Kirsten Green.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks, buddy. Kirsten Green, Deputy Director and Tribal Liaison, just here to learn and support. Thank you.
Glad you're here, Kirsten. Thank you. And Casaria, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Casaria Taylor. I'm the Senior Rules Coordinator. I am here filling in for Ingrid. So if you have any sort of tech issues, feel free to chat me.
Great. Thanks so much, Casaria. And then we have a few folks from some of my colleagues on the consultant team. Madeline, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, Madeline Miller, Senior Project Manager at Echo Northwest, and we're the prime prime consultant with the facilitator.
Thanks, Madeline. And Kate?
Morning, everyone. I'm Kate Rogers, Senior Planner and Project Manager with MIG. and we're supporting the work on the model codes.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Corliss. I am a principal at MIG, and as Kate said, we are supporting the work on the model code.
Wonderful. Thank you all. All right. With that, Sean, do you want to line us out on the racial equity framework for discussion today?
Yes, and if I also want to start a little bit, I'm going to start with just a couple notes on like what we're hoping to get out of today's meeting, because I think it's important to frame that up. So I've been using, and you guys are going to just have to sit through this because it's a bad metaphor, but I like using this metaphor because I think it helps frame out what we're trying to do. So the intent today is that we're diving into the model code. We have two like code consultants here with us, Kathy and Kate, and they're going to be helping us develop this model code and to deliver a draft by June. The metaphor I've been using is that we are opening a restaurant, and this restaurant is kind of goal 10 implementation. And the legislature, our investors, kind of told us that one part of it is going to be the signature dish called the model code, right? And they've given us some parameters like what the dish is going to be, broad steps, things like that. But they kind of have assigned to us to develop out this dish. So we hired two professional chefs, Kathy and Kate, to kind of help us prepare that dish. And they've produced a recipe for us. That's the model code framework that we included in y'all's packet. And, we're going to talk about that today and, talk about, you have a recipe. The recipe doesn't tell you how the dish is going to taste. We're going to have to wait until June before we kind of dive in and provide more detailed notes and refine it before we open the restaurant at the end of the year. But we need to give our chefs notes on this recipe about what do we want to be part of this dish? How do we want to do all that kind of stuff in order for them to be able to produce something for us by this summer. So I think I just wanted to highlight that. We're going to stretch this metaphor as we get into it. It's going to be bad. The metaphor is not going to work at certain places, but I just wanted to frame that up. Really, ideally, what we're hoping to do is give Kathy and Kate the information that they need to develop a solid first draft in June that we can then kind of refine as we get closer to our deadline by the end of the year. So with that in mind, I'll kind of dive into the racial equity framework. I have a couple slides just on the agenda that we have today. I'm going to try to keep this presentation as short as practicable while still setting up the discussion, so that way we can leave as much time for discussion as possible. And I'm going to start with the racial equity framework, and I actually think this is a pretty important stopping point, because there are actually, in kind of evaluating the different kind of lenses that we have in looking at racial equity, codes play actually a huge part in racial equity, and they have a sordid history. And so there were three pieces that I kind of wanted to talk about today or highlight at the beginning. The first one is on kind of historical inequities. And I think this is just really important to point out at the start. Zoning and like development codes generally, they have a pretty explicit history in exclusionary practices. Like if you go back in terms of constitutional law and like the founding of zoning and different development codes, they very much directly have that kind of explicit intent. And over the years, even though that intent has kind of faded, they still play a very significant role in perpetuating a lot of outcomes, especially racial and economic segregation in the United States. And I think something that we need to be very actively aware of as we're developing this model code is this is something that is seeking explicitly to redress a lot of those harms that were created in the past. I think it's also important to recognize too some of the limitations there, right? A model code is not zoning in and of itself. It is just a code that regulates development, right? So how does it actually interplay with these broader kind of historical pieces that we're going to be talking about? I think in light of that too, it's also important to be aware of the benefits and burdens. We're not going to be talking about just some kind of easy slam dunk wins. We're going to be talking about a lot of policy trade-offs that exist when you're making a development code in terms of, having impacts on certain things to achieve other public policy objectives, and there's going to be weighting that has to happen in that. And there's oftentimes not going to be easy issues. Ideally, there can be, kind of mutual wins and things that we can do to kind of advance a lot of different policy objectives, but that's something that we should be aware of. And then finally, just on the accountability, I think this one's pretty evident. This model code is going to serve an accountability function at the local level, in terms of, HAPO compliance with housing laws, as well as with the kind of at the tail end of the acceleration process, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. But also on the accountability side, this is intended to be a living document And this is a first iteration, right? We know that this is something that's going to change over time. And so there needs to be kind of this build-in of accountability about things that might need refinement in the future, right? And making sure that we're not perpetuating any harms as we kind of try to iterate on development codes to make them more equitable. So I wanted to highlight that at the beginning. I think that's something we should absolutely keep in mind as we get through this discussion, and something I hope, you know, we can think about critically as we discuss today. So with that, I'm going to start with just a little bit of a reminder on the context of the model code in terms of, you know, the statutory functions. I gave this presentation in greater depth when we had our orientation. Oh my gosh, at the end of last year, how time flies. And really, this is just going to be a reminder on the context, and then I'll kind of move into some of the things that we've already discussed, so that way we can get into a discussion building on the things we've already talked about. But let me start with the context just really quickly, just as a reminder. So there are some aspects of statute, and this is the main point here. The legislature has envisioned model codes as being part of the Goal 10 implementation framework, and they've kind of given us some specific direction in various bills about what those codes need to be, at least in this first iteration, and what the statutory functions of those codes are. So on the top here, the legislature has prescribed what specific codes that we have to produce by the end of this year. And they've specified 4 different housing types that we have to produce them for, as well as 3 different kind of population sizes of cities that we have to produce them for. And then, of course, to make it all, you know, kind of work together and to fulfill other statutory direction, we need to have a set of model procedures to, you know, be able to review applications, right? And one thing I'll add is that we can add to this over time. This is intended to be a living, breathing document, something that the HAPA will be using and building on in the future. But the legislature does prescribe a few kind of explicit statutory functions that this code is supposed to have. One is that this is supposed to be a kind of North Star. It's supposed to be a guidance and promising practice type of document to facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice. And so this code should be innovating new ways to kind of facilitate different kind of public policy objectives. The second piece is that the Senate Bill 1564, the one that directs us to produce these codes, these specific codes, adds a kind of niche function that is intended to be a tool for especially small cities, which is the ability to kind of optionally adopt a part of the code by reference. So if you're a city and you're like, we really want to legalize cottage clusters, but we don't really have the staff resources, time, and capacity to kind of keep that updated, this provides a resource that they can just kind of adopt off the shelf, and the state keeps it updated for them. And then the third function, and this one is a little bit more rigid, is that these do serve kind of regulatory and compliance functions in both the Goal 10 program as well as with the HAPO. In the Goal 10 context, and we've adopted rules on this, there's an acceleration program where, you know, if we are not meeting our goals, we kind of do an evaluation and figure out what actions can we take at the state and local levels to facilitate production. And then we enter an agreement to essentially to do those things, right? So the state provides support and funding, local governments do things within their control to facilitate production. And, you know, ideally that's how the program works. But at the tail end of that process, if, you know, folks aren't taking actions within their control, this does serve a regulatory function in that the code can apply directly to the development of housing. And of course, on the HAPO side with compliance of housing laws, these are also intended to be resources to comply with Oregon's housing laws. And right, so we'll build on this in the future with other kind of modules that are necessary for that. So with that in mind, I want to also highlight some of the opportunities there. So those were all the kind of prescriptions. Like changing any of the things I've described on the past slide would require an act of the legislature, so just keep that in mind. But there's also a lot of opportunities to shape this code to achieve outcomes that we want to see in the future, right? We have the ability to implement priorities that are discussed on this group, as well as just in the general rulemaking process. In future slides, I'm actually going to talk about some of the themes that we've already been hearing, we've already been talking about. But also, you know, we can change and refine this to suit whatever public policy objectives that we want to see over time, right? They didn't prescribe precisely what these codes have to do beyond just like what we produce and how they function under statute. And of course, we can build over time. We can add additional modules as we see necessary. And then we can draw from other types of work and align with other existing DLCD codes, because we've produced a lot already, right? We've produced an ADU model code. We've produced middle housing model codes. We've produced a walkability code in the CFEC program. And so we can align with all these different pieces as we develop these out. So With that in mind, I'm going to move to talking about a little bit about the model code framework, and then also starting to talk about some of the themes that we heard to set us up for discussion. Deb, I'm wondering if and when I should pause for kind of clarifying questions as we kind of get into this.
I think, why don't you keep going, Sean, and get through the framework and then maybe pause. I think that would be good.
That sounds good. Okay. So I'm going to start by just setting us up a little bit with the framework here. So this is one of 2 documents that we distributed to the group to kind of help set us up with our discussion. It's about a 17-page document. And really the best way, if I can get back to the metaphor to describe this, it's like we've produced kind of a recipe that describes, all right, we have this dish. What's going to be part of the dish? What are the ingredients that we include in this dish? And so you can kind of see in the framework, it outlines a lot of those different pieces. It starts with like the statutory context. It starts with kind of like what's going to be the approach of the model code and what statutory requirements is it going to align and fulfill with. And then it also kind of starts talking about a lot of the different contents. What's actually going to be in the code? What's it going to address in terms of its applicability? What are going to be the standards that are included? And then, of course, what procedures are also going to be included as part of the model code. And then the appendices kind of dive a little bit into more detail, outlining some of the more specific applicable statutes and rules. And then Appendix B kind of is like, all right, here's a matrix of all the different standards that we're considering for inclusion in the model code. And, where can we draw from existing resources and where will we have to create new code? Now, one thing, the reason I'm using this analogy is like when you read a recipe, you don't know what the dish is going to taste like, right? Like you don't know like what is it actually going to look like at the end of the process. That's something that we'll have to do come this June when we actually produce a draft code document. But it's good at giving us a relatively rough sense of like, all right, I know roughly the parameters scope of this code. I know the ingredients that are going to be included. And so hopefully the intent behind this is to give us kind of a framework to launch our discussion off of and kind of build on some of the themes that we've been discussing already. I'm not going to talk a lot about like what all specifically is in the framework, just to be sensitive to time. I want to leave as much time for discussion as we can. But the document's right there in front of you. It's easy to reference. It's not super text heavy. So, please, I highly encourage keeping it open as we get into discussion. Now, I guess maybe before we kind of move on, I think maybe we can take that pause now.
Yeah. Any questions about anything Sean just recap for you or anything in the memo itself? Clarifications before we get rolling? All right. I think we're ready to roll then.
Excellent. Great. Yeah. So, kind of bringing it back to this terrible metaphor. I think kind of the goal of today's meeting, if we're looking at this recipe, is kind of trying to say, okay, well, we want to make sure that the dish tastes this way or includes these types of ingredients or things like that. So I'm going to try to set us up a little bit with some of the discussion themes. And I also want to kind of set up a piece about this that is important and something that we'll need to figure out, but is not quite as relevant or salient to today's discussion, which is the kind of functionality of the code, where the code sits in the overall process. So I mentioned kind of earlier in this presentation that the legislature prescribed kind of 3 major statutory functions of the model code. If I could bring it back to the analogy, it's like, where is this dish in a restaurant? Like, is it an entree? Is it like, what's the price? Who cooks it? Like all these things that we have to figure out about how this dish fits within the context of our restaurant, which is Goal 10 implementation. And that's all important information to figure out. We have some notes from our investors about what it's supposed to do. But our goal today really is to give our chefs the notes that they need to actually produce the dish, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about this functionality. This is stuff that we're going to have to revisit in future conversations, but I also want to just highlight some of these decisions have been made kind of for us, right? So I do want to highlight that, and they inform how the code is going to function or how the dish is going to, be prepared, right? And I'm going to start by talking actually a little bit about the most prescriptive aspect of the code, which is as a regulatory and compliance tool. I described previously that these have 2 kind of important regulatory functions with the HAPO and LCDC. These are required. These are like directly outlined in statute as like major functionality of the code. They are designed to be, in the case of the acceleration program, at the end of the process, something that can apply directly as kind of a development or a developer's remedy kind of. And again, the intent is that we don't use it all that often, but it's supposed to be a pretty significant incentive to take actions within your control with DLCD support and funding, right? So that's something that's important to keep in the back of the mind. That's statutorily prescribed, right? Getting a little bit less prescriptive and more into the optional side of things, right? There's this kind of optional adoption and application by reference, which is really intended to be kind of a tool for small cities. I think one thing that we heard is that model codes, especially with larger cities with complex codes, is not something that's really easy to kind of fit on top of, right, and apply by reference. And that's true, right? A lot of large cities have, pretty idiosyncratic and complex codes that makes application of a model code difficult. But really, this is for a small city that like maybe has code that's from the 1980s and hasn't been updated since like the clear and objective statutes, right? This is pretty important for them as a tool to kind of enable modular implementation and opting into allowing new housing types, right? So that's a new function that I think is also important to keep in mind. And then finally, on the kind of least prescriptive end, and to give credit to a lot of large cities with more complicated codes, this is supposed to be a guidance and promising practice document, right? This is something that we're supposed to be able to draw from and to inform Goal 10 implementation. Ideally, we're going to be innovating in this code new ways to kind of facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice, and they can be informative to the actions that we take at the local level in terms of informing adoption-ready actions, innovating new promising practices, all that type of thing. So I just want to keep that functionality in mind, just to kind of speak to that. Like some of those decisions have been made. How we articulate that in the context of the Goal 10 framework is an ongoing discussion, but also that doesn't help Kathy and Kate actually write the code, right? So I want to kind of, keep that in mind as we get into discussion. We're trying to talk about what's going to be in the code that's we deliver on in June, if that's helpful context. But to dive into that a little bit more, we've actually been hearing a lot of stuff already in discussion about like what do we want to be inside the model code, or what problems do we want it to address that we want to build on in today's discussion. I distributed kind of just a brief memorandum kind of summarizing some of these different points. I want to point out that these are pretty high level. I'm not getting into like specific proposals or specific code concepts, and I'm not trying to imply that these are exhaustive or implying any kind of consensus, but just raising that like these are themes that have kind of come up in past discussion that we've heard and we want to build on in today's discussion. And so I'll kind of go through the bullet points just to describe them just in a little bit of detail. And I think ideally what we would like to do in today's discussion is really build on these and then get into a conversation about how we actually operationalize these. How do we actually facilitate outcomes that we would like to see in the code text itself? And so the first one is kind of this effectiveness as a regulatory tool. I've talked about how this is a kind of at the tail end of the acceleration program, and something that should be pretty abundantly clear about this is when it's applied as a regulatory tool, it really needs to be a very pro-housing document, right? So that's something that's kind of informative of the way that the code has to be written, right? It's like in terms of how we actually balance these different types of things. Something else that we've heard is this facilitating of local capacity building. So like when we design this code, we're designing it with a recognition that different cities have different levels of capacity, and we should try to be sensitive to work that it takes to review development at the local level, right? So trying to find ways of facilitating reducing staff workload. So, right, rather than requiring all these different public hearings and meetings that might be very difficult, especially for a smaller city, right? Trying to keep things more straightforward and to free up capacity at the local level. Something else that we've heard is that to the extent we can, we should try to align with existing department work and codes. We have codes that we can draw from, the walkability model, the ADU model code, the middle housing model code. And right, this should be a document that stitches a lot of those together and aligns with just existing work. We've also heard this point of kind of balancing promising practice with usability for small cities, right? So if we think about this functionality, it has this opt-in function that is particularly important for small cities. And if you kind of maximize the promising practice, sometimes that can, if you're a small city and you're thinking about opting in, right, and maybe a promising practice is reducing parking mandates, you might be uncomfortable with that. So, right, how do we balance that in the context of this model code to encourage opting in for the cities that may consider opting in, applying the code by reference. Another piece, and this has been probably a very significant theme that we've heard in a lot of different ways, all the way from like form-based code discussions to just increasing the allowable building envelope or density of lots, is really just generally increasing the buildable envelope and allowable like number of units beyond the status quo, especially for multi-unit development. I think something that we've heard pretty clearly is, achieving the actual production targets in the ONA is not going to happen without, as kind of a prerequisite, allowing a lot more housing units to be built in areas much more than the status quo. So the model code should really be kind of a North Star on that. Another piece that we've also heard pretty significantly is leveraging our development standards to incentivize public policy outcomes, especially the provision of affordable and accessible housing. Those have been two very significant public policy objectives that we heard, and that our development codes should really be tuned towards achieving those types of outcomes. We've also heard other public policy objectives too that should be trying to be, incorporated and incentivized. Things like unit size variety, home ownership, access to kind of public or community amenities, all those different types of things. And so we should build on that in today's discussion. Another piece that we've also definitely heard is reducing uncertainty and delay for production. Ministerial review has been a pretty hot topic, as well as kind of streamlining or expediting review in certain cases. So that's part of how we think about procedures. And then finally, for a lot of housing types, especially multi-unit and single unit, this is going to be one of the first articulation of a reasonable set of siting and design regulations. And so kind of making sure that we tune these appropriately is going to be a pretty important task as we get into it. So again, I don't want to imply that these themes are the end all be all, but these are just some of the things that I wanted to relay back that we've heard, and we want to build on in today's discussion. We don't need to like repeat these ideas, but hopefully we can start having a conversation a little bit more about what's missing from this list. And then of course, how do we actually operationalize what's on this list? I think that's going to be a pretty important discussion. So with that, we have kind of 3 discussion questions. The first 2 are getting on that, what I've mentioned, like talking about what themes are missing and then talking about how we operationalize this. And then the third one, I think this is would be a great question to get into if we have time. We know that this is going to be a document that we build on and iterate on over time. And so kind of talking about what else do we want this to do as we, kind of continue on with Goal 10 implementation would be a great topic if we have time to get into. Also, for the mega code nerds out there, I did distribute kind of a really in-depth questionnaire on like specific development standards and topics that is very long and completely optional, right? And so I provide this. This is something that's going to be open until March 12th. Don't open this right now. I would like to focus our piece on discussion, but if you have time over the next 2 weeks, it'd be great if you could dive in there and provide your feedback if you want to. But yeah, before we dive into discussion, I see we probably have some questions. So yeah, Dave, please feel free.
The questionnaire public. I have a lot of contacts that would love to reply.
Yes, we speak to that in the description of the questionnaire. Please don't distribute this to all of your contacts. You are welcome to kind of coordinate with and talk with people in your networks to kind of facilitate some responses on this questionnaire. Once we actually produce the model code, we will have an opportunity for kind of public input and feedback on the model code itself. So keep your eyes peeled for that. To kind of keep things manageable for us, I kind of asked to not distribute this to a wide audience.
Distribute the questions manually and kind of combine.
Yeah, you're welcome to coordinate with people in your networks to say like, hey, what do you guys think about parking? And then relay that back to us in your response. That's totally fine.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for asking, Dave. Any other functional questions? All right, let's get going then with the first couple of questions. May bleed into each other, but let's try to take them one by one. So first question, DLCD's recorded a variety of thematic policy priorities for incorporation in the model code. Sean just went through all those at a high level, including from the HOG yourselves. Are there themes missing as you sort of read through that memo with the discussion themes? Did you sort of find some gaps in thinking that we need to be considering as well that hasn't already been said to your knowledge, or that you'd like to highlight? Yeah, Karen.
Hi. So I'm not certain that this speaks directly to the question, but I'll use this as an opportunity to provide this input. Is as we were reviewing the material, we had some I don't know if I'd call it concerns, but I just put a flag in the use of new acronyms that may be not commonly used, right? And so as we think as we're developing these materials, that maybe we should think about how each jurisdiction may either be familiar with that acronym or not, and as the model code is developed. So I'm not certain that that's a theme, but I did want to provide that as input into kind of this process. It kind of came up specifically even like as a part of the framework document that was put together as I was talking with some of my colleagues. Things like we're all familiar with ADU, right? Accessory dwelling unit, but perhaps something like multi-unit and the acronym of MU may not be as common, right? And may not be as reflective throughout people's codes. So I guess I would just add that comment.
Yeah, maybe a good reminder for spelling out acronyms as much as possible, because they do tend to confuse comprehension sometimes. Thank you, Karen. Shannon, hi.
Good morning. So many thoughts and so excited, right? Really appreciate the thoughtfulness in this framework. I see the intentional weaving into the recipe of ingredients that have been suggested at prior meetings to extend the metaphor further. So that's very exciting. As I think about some realities, right, that we are increasingly seeing on the ground, and what I anticipate may be ongoing challenges, I just wanted to elevate that we need to be able to insure these homes, no matter the type that's being built. And I know that shouldn't, I think, normally be a consideration at the level of code, but I think it might need to be in the near future with the insurance challenges in our region, that's the word. So for example, here's where I'm going. Like landscaping parameters with cottage clusters, slight pet peeve here anyways, but there could be common areas like some of us saw recently in Bend, Oregon, where AstroTurf was used, which is not going to be putting plants next to the house. Recycled materials that are fire hardened, that in some parts of our state, right, that fire, like my home that I bought with this awesome passion vine on a trellis, like next to the siding, like there might be a drone flyover that tells me I can't have that anymore, that it has to go on my backyard fence, right? Like just wanted to, not in a crazy alarmist way, but like these are new realities that many of us are starting to contend with. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. And I think, thank you for the example too. It sounds like you're also pointing out it's obviously not just city regulations that are kind of driving how things get built or what gets built. And I know, I don't think Rachel's here today, but I know she reminds us from the lender side of things, but also from the insurance side of things and others. Appreciate that. Anne.
Yeah, I'm excited about the model code. I appreciate all the work that's gone into it so far for the framework. I was just thinking about housing choice and how important it is that cities need to provide housing choice and diversity for all along the spectrum and make sure that we have those home ownership opportunities. I mean, I know middle housing, you can divide it, but it isn't just that easy to do and set up with the utilities and everything. So I don't know, if it belongs here in the model code or if we'll have anything related to land divisions or, I mean, we've got, Senate Bill 458 language, whatever, and maybe some changes, but I feel like diversity within neighborhoods is really important, or diversity within areas of a city is really important, so that you can avoid having a concentration of just one housing type in an area, so that you've got, well, people can have flexibility if they need to be in a certain area to age in place or within the neighborhood or whatever. But I just feel like housing choice is really important, and diversity, housing diversity.
Do you, just to pull that thread a little bit more, and do you see spots in the framework where maybe that needs to be woven in more, or you didn't see it in the framework? Sorry, I just want to get to more if we can.
I mean, there is sort of the middle housing land division, and there's the land division. It's just, I mean, we're really talking about what houses are allowed and what are the development standards, but how do you get that variety? I mean, Albany hasn't done it yet. I think I've mentioned in past meetings that some cities do have a requirement for housing variety, and we're trying to meet so many different needs at all the different income spectrums, and especially those that are, the lower income level. I don't know. I mean, it's too early to tell with this framework. I just wanted to raise that as a goal, possibly, because communities need a variety of housing types. We don't need just multi-dwelling units, for example. So that's all.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Sean?
Yeah, and this is one of those topics that's kind of bleeding also into the third question too, because one of the aspects, like, unit variety is something that makes a lot of sense. Like if you have a subdivision code, right, where somebody's platting out land, and like maybe there's provisions around achieving a certain mix of a variety of unit types. So it's not all, say, detached single unit, not all, say, multi-unit, but a variety of things. And so I think that's something that's important, but we also weren't given that like direction and funding for subdivision code. So it might need to be a module that we add on over time. That said, to the extent that we can facilitate diversity as much as we can in this code, I think that's a good point.
Great. Thank you. Matt, good morning.
Good morning. So I just had a couple comments. First, I really like that the themes sheet highlighted that accessible and affordable housing is just as important as production, because I think that sometimes gets lost in the conversation where we get very focused on production but not achieving equitable production. And so those are two really important factors, affordability and accessibility for AFFH. The one thing I did want to suggest is it might be worthwhile to consider separating accessibility and affordability out and a little bit from each other, because I think it does get a little bit confusing. This really came to mind when I was looking at the Housing Model Code Framework, Appendix B, because it talks about standards and has accessibility, affordability, incentives, and density bonuses, and it leaves ADU blank. And I could see how that might be true for affordability, but it seems that I don't know everything about ADU model codes, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you probably could include accessibility into some of the model code by ADU housing type.
Yeah, and I think that concept, and Kathy, Kate, please feel free to chime in too. But I think a lot of that concept was referring to, like, density bonus. Say, like, if you're giving an additional floor and additional units and floor area for a particular project, tying that to certain incentives around, like, if you provide accessible units beyond what's required in the building code, you can get a bonus to offset, the additional cost. Or similarly, if you're building affordable housing, right, just like more units, a kind of bonus that's provided there. That's kind of a question that we definitely want to grapple with in the context of multi-unit code, but are there opportunities to grapple with it in ADU codes? No ADU codes have done that in the past, but this is a space to innovate. So, I think with that, maybe I'll invite Kathy, Kate to chime in with any thoughts they might have.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, it's an interesting suggestion. I think we were trying to, of course, keep that list, abbreviated just to the big ideas. I think you're right, though. For example, with ADUs, we could think about, for example, maybe bonus square footage, if it were single story or something like that to facilitate accessibility, right? So I could see something like that being, considered separately. So good suggestion. And I think we'll make sure we'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think one other, factor that came to mind when I was thinking about ADUs was external versus internal ADUs, because internal ADUs are typically accessed by a stair. Well, I shouldn't say typically, but often accessed by stairs because they're separate from the main unit in one way or the other, and that would possibly make them less accessible than like an external ADU, where it's more likely to have a 0-step entry and things like that.
Fair enough. Thank you. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick note that I have a 10 a.m., so I'll have to hop in a minute. But kind of flipping back and forth between Appendix B and the kind of model code content number 4 for permitted uses and approval processes. I don't want to use the wrong term here, so I'm going to try to say de minimis accommodations, I guess, instead of like adjustments or variances. But for example, like with the walkability code, right? If you have one unit on an infill lot, are you still going to be an outright permitted use? And are you still going to have the same kind of approval process as the same unit being built as like part of, let's say, a greenfield development, right? So for example, like if you're doing like, a home on an infill lot, the rest of the layout of the area might not be up to that walkable design. But I don't think that should prohibit that from being still a permitted use. Still getting a unit on the ground. Otherwise, you'd have to change the entire underlying infrastructure of the area. So some kind of flexibility to like accommodate for the de minimis differences while still allowing the same kind of process and approval.
Okay, helpful. Any thoughts from the team or questions for Brock about that one before we move along? Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Brock. Hi, Matt, go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that I'm thinking about, it does intersect with the increased buildable envelope beyond the status quo, especially for multifamily development, along with it line with existing department work and codes. And there's two sorts of things that I think will be important to consider in the model code, especially for larger jurisdictions in that multifamily development. But one of the forthcoming sort of changes that is being considered by the State Building Codes Department, of course, is single stair and the different types of building typologies that can be unlocked with that, in terms of a more compact but taller building that might not take up as much lot coverage, but would allow sort of additional space in the lot for other priorities. And just wanting to make sure that that kind of, as that's coming through the pipeline, and I think some other local jurisdictions are interested in exploring exemptions to state building code to allow for that, that flexibility also be considered within this, or ready to also be implemented once the state building code department makes a decision, which I think is supposed to be by the end of this year, if I'm not mistaken. I'm looking mostly for Michael, if he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I just wanted to name that as well.
So thinking about how this model code could flex with some new rules that way. Michael, go ahead.
That is my understanding is I think the BCD is aiming to get something in the October 1st update to the state structural code.
And correct me if I'm mistaken. So because we have been flagging there has been a rule change to enable like stacked attached units. So like say like a townhouse on a lot, there's a unit on the bottom, there's a unit on the top, they're separated by a fire like separation. But then you could connect it to another. So ostensibly on 2 lots, you could have essentially what would be like a plex without requiring second stair. And we can kind of fan out from there. And so we are tracking that, but I have not heard about a single stair concept so far. Is this distinct from that?
It is distinct from that, yeah. So the single stair is basically a return to some of the older sort of building typologies, of course.
Unfamiliar, yeah.
Yeah, but more specifically, I know that, there was a law passed, I think it was in the last session, to make the Building Codes Department kind of consider this as an opportunity, especially for this like taller, up to potentially 6 floors, and just wanting to consider that because I think that is kind of a really good typology to enable sort of homeownership and condos, but also more family responsive and culturally responsive rental housing as well. In the space that I see a lot, folks are clamoring really for a window and a kitchen, but how we build things currently and how code prescribes a building on a lot makes me present a choice to them. Okay, you really only can have a window in one area. Do you want it in the living room or the kitchen? People really want both, but when you force them because of sort of existing code, both building and zoning code into one or the other, it forces that choice when that's not necessarily something that has to be forced upon folks.
And Sean, I can email you the latest of my understanding about the BCD conversation on that, if that's
Okay.
useful.
Great.
Great. Thank you all. Shannon.
Yeah, just so quickly, because it did come up and it feels so timely to me. There is a bill up for hearing on Monday in House Housing and Homelessness, which is HB 2138-1, which is about making improvements to the middle housing land division implementation. So if there's some cities want to like take a hard look, provide support testimony, like good timing. And then while I understand that this isn't code exactly, I remain optimistic / a little bit concerned about standardizing statutes or options for cities of various sizes to opt in to the middle housing revolving loan fund. And I just would appreciate understanding, like, is stuff like that happening too for these cities of varying sizes, so that there can be, because OHCS just launched the opportunity to apply. I'm a little worried about rural cities getting left behind. Thanks.
Oh yeah, correct me if I'm understanding this incorrectly, but my understanding is the middle income revolving loan fund. It's not just like only middle housing. It's open to anything that meets specific like parameters, which include income parameters, and it's available for like low income. It's also available for like middle income developments, and it's administered by cities. I think the bigger barrier is there's an administrative requirement on the city's end, and that's going to pose challenges that would need to be gapped with like technical assistance, that type of thing.
Yeah, so if I may, as I understand it, like a city and county need to talk to each other, pass some kind of agreement to move forward, and then apply to OHCS. And I just am, so again, I can take this offline, but I have this like, I know some rural developments, right, that some nonprofits are trying to do that could really like use this kind of resource potentially, but I'm worried that cities with larger capacity and staffing are gonna like just get right in and leave some more rural communities in the dust potentially. Maybe not. That's my concern.
Okay,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
Just maybe a follow-up question. I'm trying to I'm trying to understand how this connects to the model code, and I'm like, I'm struggling. Could you help make that connection for me?
Well, I guess I think it's not code, right? I think it's a statute, but I think there's a similar set of barriers for communities in these different sizes that are so neatly described in this model code breakout by the legislature. And I am concerned because I feel like maybe there hasn't been, and I could be wrong, but similar thought about capacity issues implementing new programs as there is around model code, I guess. So again, I'll totally drop it. I know this is a model code conversation. I just feel like it troubles my brain and heart a little bit to see this thoughtfulness about cities of different sizes. Like, let's crosswalk, let's be careful. And then it's like, here's a new program, go get it if you can.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Actually, can we spend some time on that a little bit? Because that is a salient topic that we've been thinking about, but it'd be great to have maybe a little bit more dedicated discussion. I think all of this is bleeding into the second question too, Deb. So I'm just going to paste it into the chat, which is like, we're talking about these things, these themes, and we want to make sure that we're operationalizing these themes. So I'm going to just include this in the chat. I think these first
Great.
two questions are things that we're just talking about already.
And if I could just, let me just sort of recap some of it's sort of a blend already, as Sean's saying, like bigger themes and getting into more specifics, but here are some big things I think we've generally heard so far. Need the model code would be best, or this is your advice for additional themes, is aiming for diversity of types and all sorts of places. Having common language that, just making sure the words we use in the model code are easily applicable in all sorts of cities with all sorts of different ways they word things, or at least being explicit about what we mean, for instance, about multi-unit housing. Think about how, and I think, Sean, you've already sort of set up this modular piece, but maybe this is a little different, but think about how the model code can be constructed in a way that can flex with evolving other statutory requirements or openings, including maybe some new building code, just sort of how easily it would be for the model code to respond to that. Distinguish between accessibility and affordability rather than lump them together, and then also acknowledge that there can be some accessibility with ADU units. Matt pointed out that might be more external ADU units are better suited for accessibility, but than internal, but maybe not necessarily. And also just be mindful of different contexts of infill versus greenfield, and sort of how the model code might work and guide cities differently that way. I don't think I missed any big pieces. Some of those are more specific, some of those are high level. But carrying on the conversation, thank you for posting the question in the chat, Sean. Are there more specific policy concepts that you'd like to encourage DLCD to include in the model code than what you're seeing in the framework memo?
And I actually have just an initial kind of set up, like an example of a theme that we can talk a little bit more about specific concepts or operationalization, just building on Shannon's point, and like thinking about this broad understanding of, like, when we're talking about smaller communities, we are talking about folks that might not even have a planner on staff, and trying to balance like staff capacity, trying to balance the fact that like a lot of small cities, like for example, cities below 2,500 don't have to comply with the ADU law or middle housing laws. And that's, in recognition of capacity. How do we want to structure this code to acknowledge and grapple with that, knowing that like population is not the best metric to understand capacity. It's kind of an imperfect proxy. But are there ways, like, for example, if we're thinking about different requirements or different procedure types or anything like that, should we try to consider tiering, right? Like by different city sizes to try to acknowledge some of these differences? Are there specific ways that we should try to construct different standards? One question that we're kind of grappling with is, do you incorporate like compromises on promising practice to make a optional code more enticing for a small city, right? Like maybe a city's not ready or feeling able to, eliminate parking mandates, but there might be a code that they would consider opting into because it's more pro-housing, right? And is it worthwhile to kind of consider that trade-off by, tiering standards a little bit? And we asked more detailed questions actually in the questionnaire, but let's open that up a little bit. Just this basic concept of navigating different levels of capacity between cities and how we can try to structure the model code imperfectly to try to account for some of that.
Yeah, Matt.
It seems to me that smaller cities' obstacle to adopting some of the model codes could be much driven by resources. So I think maybe one thing to consider is whether more resources could be made available to cities in exchange for adopting the model policy, but that would come with a cost, obviously.
All right, that's an interesting idea. Financial incentive for adopting into the model code, especially for smaller cities. I am curious, we have two cities in actual city staff in the room, one from very large city, Portland, and one from a small to medium-sized city, Anne in Albany. I'm curious about your sort of question, or sorry, your thoughts on the question Sean just asked, about how things could be tiered to meet both of your city's needs and others, of course. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're lumped in with the large cities on middle housing and everything else, but I mean, I don't know if within the model code you can kind of have a different section for, you know, and what's the break? I mean, we sort of talked about this a little bit, Deb, when we had our one-on-one. It's like, where's the breaking point for the city sizes and the types of housing units or the standards or whatever, the staff capacity. I mean, things are so different between us and Corvallis, for example. But yeah, in the model code, I feel like there are some minimums, you know, that would apply to everybody, but maybe in smaller cities, you're just not going to see even 4-story, you know, 5-story buildings, et cetera. I mean, you know, where you're looking at standards and setbacks. I don't know. I mean, some of the stuff is related to the size of the development and not necessarily the city size. So, you know, I just don't know. I mean, I don't have any obviously clear thoughts about it, but I think site size, like I'm thinking about smaller infill sites, you know, 1 acre versus like a 2 or more acre, may be a way to break things down a little bit. And when you're looking at setbacks and landscaping and all that kind of stuff, transition, that knowing that smaller cities are going to have smaller scale developments because things just don't pencil to go taller. I don't know. Those are my initial ramblings.
I think that's helpful. Thank you for being put on the spot. And Ariel's distracted with another task on the other end right now, so she's not able to chime in, but we'll get her thoughts. Anyone else have comments specifically about the city size tiering, but also generally the question of things that need to be in the model code? Dave, yeah.
I'm a little bit new to some of this, so apologies if there's a naivete to my questions, but what does the size of the city have to do with, and the capacity of the staff have to do with a model code? Isn't the model code meant to simplify everything for everybody? And like, for instance, parking, why does it matter if a city is big or small versus whether or not a code requires parking? It seems to me to be more of a philosophical question about whether parking should be something that is mandated or something that is driven by demand.
Yeah, this might be a kind of an interesting question. There's a few differences that happen once you get below certain population thresholds that make a lot of decisions harder. Like, you'll notice that most of our middle housing laws, ADU laws, like a lot of our housing laws don't apply actually below a certain population threshold. And like more or less the rationale for a lot of these is it kind of creates a burden. Like if you are a small city with very limited like resources, you're likely actually not going to have a professional planner on staff. You don't even have somebody who can like understand and implement the law on behalf of you. And you have like hundreds of cities in this category. It's kind of like a hockey graph, right? In terms of the number of cities that exist there, even though it's a very small percentage of the population overall in Oregon, right? So a lot of times in those discussions, the conversation is like, all right, well, how much are we willing to kind of impose as a mandate upon cities to allow different housing types when they barely have the resources to like process a permit, right? And then there's other considerations too, like in a lot of smaller cities, you're going to notice that like oftentimes development activity is very limited generally. The market's oftentimes different. Like you certainly can't get a 5/1 podium construction to pencil in a lot of these markets, much less even just like maybe a 3 or 4 story apartment building, right? And so there's limited ability from a market perspective for a lot of these to pencil. So that's another consideration. And then also there's a political dimension to this too. If you bring a code to them and say, all right, we've decided that parking is no longer a thing. Do you want to opt in? you don't have to, a lot of councils are going to look at that and say, no, thank you. We'll continue on with what we've got, right? Because,
that makes a lot more sense, the political angle, because I mean, a model code could have all sorts of provisions for things that can't pencil in the real world, but who cares? It's still there. But if people have to opt in, that makes more sense. I'll just make the point, and then I'll stop talking, that a lot of small cities, even though they have limited staff, have been more than willing to put in exclusionary codes over the decades that are highly complex and difficult to navigate. And so for me, it doesn't carry water that the staff level is some barrier to providing a code that is clear and reasonable and that promotes housing.
And it kind of varies between, like, not all cities below 2,500 are the same. Some are growing very fast, so they have a very significant amount of resources to hire staff to do code amendments. And you might be experiencing things that are totally valid in that context. But there's also a lot that are like maybe limited development activity. There's like they have a city recorder on staff, right? There's not all of these cities are made equally. So like population size is kind of an imperfect proxy for capacity and resources.
Yeah, and thank you, Dave, for the question and comments, and appreciate the thought as well that the model code should be making things easier for everyone, regardless of how many staff or what staff or how many people live in that city. So I think that's something to continue to be mindful of. Shannon.
Well, Sean, I think you just spoke to this really well, so I'll be very brief. For what it's worth, in my mind, and this is part of an ongoing conversation that USDA has facilitated too, right? Like there are big differences between rural writ large, and then are we talking about a frontier community? Maybe in the southeastern quadrant of the state, right, where it's hard even to like get cement trucks to come and really expensive, like that's a different kind of thing. Or are we talking about like a vacation destination community on the coast or in Central Oregon, and that puts different kinds of pressure on planning and economy when a lot of people want to have second homes. So just that small isn't monolithic. Thanks.
Yeah, great point. And whether a city is growing and the rate it's growing makes a difference as well. Yeah. Karen.
So I thought I would also add on to this conversation.
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge you earlier. I apologize. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I wanted to add on to this conversation because I think it is really important. And I do think that the theme of simplifying is applicable to all sizes of jurisdiction and not just small. And I feel like that is really, we talk about that in that having that interest in making just the development review process go faster, right? And so we don't want to be making this, and we wouldn't want the model code to be so complex that it was slowing down the process. And again, I think that's just as applicable in a large jurisdiction as in a small jurisdiction. So to me, I think that's really important. And things like, so we spent a little time starting to go through the survey. And one of the questions had been around maximum density versus form-based code and whatnot. And I feel like that was one space where, form-based code is more complex in a different way of implementing, perhaps getting to the same goals as having some maximum density requirements. And I would lean towards something that's not moving us to more complexity, but something that we can be doing in a consistent way, and that gets us to the same place.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that. So definitely hearing from multiple angles here, hearing the theme of needing something simple and straightforward makes things easier for everyone in all places. Gust.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I love the conversation around trying to integrate the simplicity for all city sizes. I think as you get on one side or the other, it becomes a little bit less simple. But I think using that concept is where we should be. One of the things that I have been working on that's really reared its head again um, as kind of a needed um, uh, simplicity, I guess, maybe for lack of a better word, is I'm working in a community up in Wallowa County, and I can't get the city to respond to me about a building or about a zoning code. And so my my thinking is that because that's probably the tip of the iceberg, it's going to take a while for a development um, to occur in that community, because I just can't get even a question answered about whether we can expand the zone to meet a certain development style I want. So my thought was creating we're working a model code, and we've touched on possibly model plans, and then I'm taking it to a next third step, which would be model development. And so I'm proposing like a 4-unit detached cottage cluster concept that has all the quantities of landscaping, driveway surfaces, setbacks. The building code, the building plans are approved, and you can submit this. Say it's a 4-unit development to Wallowa County, and they look at it, and it's almost like offering them I don't want to use the word diet pill, but just say some type of here you go. It might not be ideal, but it does work, and that could kick the ball into motion where it's okay. Well, that's great. We don't like this. Let's tweak it. And so I guess my thought is allowing those types of things to come into evolution where they exist for communities to use. It doesn't have to be for rural and frontier communities. Obviously, it could be for any, but it is a kind of a one-stop shop option. So that was just the thought I had, that we might be able to move into a work group.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If I can just build on that a little bit, I think you're kind of right in pointing that like this is like a scaffolding, right? Where you start with some of these pieces that are going to build and iterate over time, like the model code. You want to build on that with like, ready build plans. That's something that's going to require collaboration with building codes division. And then, right, even getting more advanced from there. I think that's all like very salient. Something that I'd be very interested in, Gus, because like the code here is actually kind of designed to, or it's supposed to at least help facilitate this type of outcome. So like if you're looking at a cottage cluster, but maybe a city is very small, they don't have a code that like facilitates cottage cluster development, but you provide this as an option to say, hey, this is something you can adopt by reference for this zone, right? With that, and the state will keep it updated for you, and you can legalize this housing type that I've got ready to go for you. I think looking at the code with that eye to like, hey, does this code make sense in the context of small cities to build, say, like these small cottage projects that you have in mind would be very helpful for us as we like develop and draft out. We'll be thinking about that as we do it, but once we actually publish a draft in June, that'd be very helpful to have that input just broadly from the development community. So I say that to everybody on this call here. It'd be helpful to like review the code and like think about this in the context of projects that you've worked on, and to ensure that this like adds value to that, especially in small communities, but also just generally.
And I'm hearing Gus say as well, like one step further from ready build plans is sort of something that includes site plans or sort of model site plans with those building plans.
Yeah.
To take it one step further for future module thinking.
Yeah, right. Scaffolding, right?
Yeah. Interesting idea, Gus. Thank you. And I saw some nodding heads there as well. Any other specific model code concepts that you haven't seen on paper, you haven't heard about this morning that you'd like to talk about?
And if I could throw out there too, a lot of the like questionnaire asks some specific things on like you know, like floor area or parking or, you know, X, Y, and Z. We could spend some time diving into some of those specifics if we want to. But also, you know, we don't have to. But Garland, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, and just before I get to Garland, for you all to chew on, I just want to point out, Sean gave a couple of ideas in the agenda under the second question there. We've touched on a little bit the sort of, potential for more specific siting design regulations maybe, but also incentives or procedural requirements the code applies. So if you want to think about that and give us some opinions about that, we would welcome those. Garland.
So I just wanted to talk about form-based codes because that came up in our mirror board as something that we many of us thought was a direction that the state should go. This was also back when we were doing the residential infill project stakeholder advisory committee in Portland, something that came up and we recommended that city staff pursue. City staff said they didn't have the resources to do it, otherwise they agreed. And so right now I'm concerned that the answer is going to be the same, that state of Oregon's going to be like, oh, form-based codes, we love it, but we don't have the resources to do it. And I'm concerned also that the team that was hired to develop this model code doesn't have form-based coding experience and doesn't have experience pivoting from the smart code, which is the open source form-based code, to be able to even write a draft model form-based code for the state of Oregon. Sean.
Yeah. Can I chime in on that a little bit, because I think there's some like questions, because not all form-based codes are made the same, and actually like there's also a question about applicability, right? This has to be a code that's designed to apply everywhere in the state. And if you're looking at like the strictest definition of form-based code, which is completely agnostic to use and density, but is based on transects, that gets really difficult to overlay on top of density provision, like density-based codes, right? Like how do you do that? Like, a lot of the feedback around form-based codes is that you engage in this full-on effort in the community to decide what your transects are and like what different kind of building envelopes are. But also there's different flavors of form-based code. Like there are, in the context of multi-unit development, it is possible to not regulate maximum density, but instead to regulate building envelope. That is a form-based regulation for multi-unit development that is not quite the same as the transect concept, but still incorporates the idea. I think what we've been hearing is more like our kind of status quo of regulating the density of especially multi-unit dwellings and really limiting both the envelope and the like the number of units that you can build is very restrictive, especially to like affordable housing projects. So we should try to find a way to fix that. And thinking about form-based codes is a way to help us kind of get there, but not so much that we need to make a like full-on form-based code for the entire state that like somehow manages to overlay on top of density-based zoning designations with transects, right? Like that's really hard to do. And like, what problem does that solve, right?
Well,
so can we dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, that solves a lot of problems actually. And so I think a lot of the problems with form-based codes is that on the West Coast in the planning industry, practitioners just don't understand form-based codes. We don't have a lot of experience with true form-based coding on the West Coast. Most people in their professional careers have never really worked with them in a large degree. And so as a result, there's a lot of myths and half-truths that are bandied about regarding form-based codes, and you sort of just repeated some of those. And so I'm not trying to drag anyone here. I'm just in working nationally, it's become super clear to me that the Southeast and the Northeast and the Midwest all have a lot of experience working with form-based codes, but on the West Coast, unless you have actually had a contract with Opticos Design, you probably haven't been exposed to form-based coding in its more pure form. What we have in Portland and throughout Oregon are what's known as a hybrid code. So it's a code that pivots from a Euclidean zoning code, but then includes some form-based elements.
Right. Can we dive into that a little bit more? Because I actually have read Opticos codes, and I also can say they are some of the most complex codes I've ever read. Right. So like that directly conflicts with some of the things that we've been talking about. And,
yeah.
and I would also
Opticos,
like to know, yeah.
So Opticos occupies a unique space. Their form-based codes don't pivot from the smart code, which is open source. They have their own boutique form-based codes, and they kind of operate at the high end of the market. Dan Froelich really believes in design as a driver of livability and believes that people should live in beautiful communities. And so Opticos codes really try to solve for beauty in what they regulate. And talking to Dan, one of his top critiques of Oregon and Portland and how we've chosen to regulate middle housing is that we completely ignore the necessary role of design in producing beautiful outcomes. And as a result, we're embarking on a path that's just going to piss off the neighbors, because we're going to allow a bunch of really ugly buildings to be built in the name of, infill and all of our things that we care about. But that the neighbors are just going to be increasingly pissed off over time as more and more ugly infill buildings come in, because we continue to not regulate beauty or the elements of design that, going back over 5,000 years of architecture, you could say, well, those are objective elements of beauty that we could be regulating, but we chose not to. So as a result, I would say Opticos codes tend to be a little bit overly complex from a certain point of view, because they're trying to facilitate beautiful outcomes. I would, by the way, agree with Dan and the need to code for human beauty, but it's just not really part of the West Coast planning culture. And so that does represent like a big shift, a big change for us to start regulating in a form-based manner beauty. Yeah, Sean.
Can we go back to benefits and burdens really fast? Because
Yes.
there are features that regulating beauty has trade-offs for. So like, for example, if you build stairs up to a raised platform building, right, that's part of traditional architecture, right? Especially it helps prevent against flooding. Well, you've just made it an accessible unit to somebody with a mobility device, right? Like there are bona fide trade-offs that we are trying to like address and account for in this process that, I think design and like good design outcomes is certainly one of those, but also possesses a lot of trade-offs to it. And I don't know, I feel like that's maybe a little bit unfair to say that Portland is, building a bunch of ugly buildings. I live in Portland. I'm seeing units that are legalized now under the, code that they've developed. I think they look great. Personally, I would live in one. I'm actually considering purchasing one. I don't know. It's just something maybe we could like dive into a little bit with a little bit more nuance. I'm interested in understanding how we can leverage different code ideas to achieve public policy outcomes that we've talked about in this space. I don't know that like kind of dragging us on our ability to like implement a perfect form-based code in the context of that fits perfectly over every, city's Euclidean zoning designations is like, what does that solve? What does that help us solve is I guess my broader question.
Well, I would say that getting rid of Euclidean zoning is itself a goal that we should aim for. Euclidean zoning was developed to encode racism and racial segregation across America. And it does by encoding economic segregation. And so we should absolutely just have a goal that is stated that we are here to get rid of Euclidean zoning because we're here to eliminate racial segregation. And so let's just be blunt about it. I think it doesn't help us to try and hide our motivations when our motivations are so just. We should be very upfront with an anti-segregationist agenda. And so I don't think that trying to retain Euclidean zoning is a goal that we should solve for. So let me just put that out there. That's my first reaction. My second reaction is I understand the politics. And so you actually said something, you said overlay, and in places like Cincinnati that have adopted form-based codes, they've often done so incrementally and using overlays. And so the first step to adopting a form-based code is often to overlay it on top of the existing code and just say, when you're pulling a permit, you can choose which code you're applying with. You can use the existing code or you can use the form-based overlay. And allowing both codes to just exist simultaneously for a while is often a successful strategy for implementing a form-based code, because you can crash test it without getting rid of the alternative to just not use it. So if people want to do stuff the old way, they can. If people want to try the new thing, they can crash test it. And then over time, it can be incrementally improved, because anytime you roll out a new code, there's going to be things that need to be fixed, within a year or 2 years.
Yeah. Well, this has been an interesting dialogue. I'll kind of invite Kathy, Kate, if you guys want to chime in.
Yeah, again, you're right. We haven't implemented a pure form-based code It's been difficult to do so in Oregon. In part, I think jurisdictions have struggled to get them to be entirely clear and objective to the extent that's required by LUBA. You know, I think it's defining all the terms, all the means of measurement, I think has been challenging. I guess if we're looking at if we were to take the idea of let's get rid of Euclidean zoning, and of course, in this situation, we're really only looking at residential and residential in the context of mixed use areas. So it's, you know, we can't evaporate uses per se. I think that would be beyond the scope of this project. But if we were to say, okay, within the model code, we will not acknowledge that there are areas in cities that are currently zoned low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity. Every area that allows housing gets the same height, FAR, you know, whatever that is, right? That's one way to kind of get at your point, right? Which is there is no separation of areas of a jurisdiction. Is that getting at kind of some of your concerns? I mean, is that something that the rest of the group would support or recommend? Do we need those differences?
I would say that the transect is how you in a form-based code, that's how you're supposed to account for differences between like the center of a city, the main street, maybe central neighborhoods that maybe you want more intensity, and then surrounding lower density transition neighborhoods between the town and the rural areas, and then the rural areas themselves.
Of course, I realize that, but we can't, you know, everything I've read and understood, and I have spent a lot of time studying form-based codes because we think about them a lot and we try and be influenced by those ideas. So I would say to apply transects where you really need to think about the specific city, right? So asking a city to adopt by reference a code without, like we could say, these are the transects, but you need to figure out where those transects are in your city. That's a big task. So I think that's been one of our concerns is like, if we did do that, the cities would then be in a position to have to go through that step. Not the end of the world if they had the funding and staffing to do it. It would also be hard.
There's a role for the state here, and this has been a conversation that we've been having in California. Now we're having it in Oregon, had it a few years ago in New York. There's a potential role for the state in coming out and saying, here's a map of every place in the state and what we think the existing transect zone is. Local jurisdiction, can you please review this map and make any adjustments that you think we probably got it wrong? But here's like the menu of options. Look at your map and please, let us know, which areas are which transect zones, and then that provides the basis of your model code. That's, I think that there's something, because you're right, you can't really expect a local jurisdiction to start from nothing, not ever having seen a transect or a form-based code, to being able to classify their city without some hand-holding, but providing something to pivot from, and then a guidebook on how to do that pivoting that's simple. You could explain it on a one-sheeter front and back. In terms of what a small town would need to understand. I think that's possible, but absolutely what we're talking about, it would be then at the very cutting or bleeding edge of statewide planning policy innovation, because no state has yet cracked that nut. There's just been statewide conversations about how to do it.
All right, I'm going to pull us back. Thank you all. I think we got to a place where we have some additional ideas for how form-based code could come about in a model statewide way. That might be, some pieces might be for future modules, what you were just talking about, Garland. But let's keep sort of plodding away at this and pursuing what we can at this point in time, given the construct of the statutory requirements and policy objectives, and then what might be possible later on that front. But I just want to recognize we have about 20 minutes, and I want to make sure we're touching other parts of this conversation about model code and what would be useful for cities to make this something applicable. easily, simply. Other thoughts? Yeah, Julia. Hi.
This is not responding to that question, but I just have a couple of thoughts swirling around in my head that I wanted to toss in the mix, kind of related to some of the notes around trade-offs and just some lenses related to that, as well as just kind of, I don't know, kind of perspectives to maybe consider or pursue on the model code front. So one of those is I was glad to see incentive-based considerations, I guess, related to accessibility and affordability noted. And I don't have any other lenses that I would immediately want to push for that incentive-based thought process, but I do just want to encourage us to continue to keep leaning into incentive-based model codes and not just regulatory, because I think those can be really powerful. They provide some good flexibility for the developers and designers to kind of lean into as well without it just being one or the other. And yeah, Shannon, I am channeling you, and I really appreciate you always bringing this up because I just think it's such a good point. And one that is just can be really powerful if formulated correctly. And then the other piece kind of on the trade-offs and kind of equity pieces, I'm not necessarily hearing anything directly that conflicts this with this, but I just wanted to bring up one example that came up when I was doing advocacy around the residential infill project in Portland as an example. And that being kind of culturally specific preference that can get regulated out of existence by either intention or accident if we're a little too prescriptive. So when I was working for a culturally specific organization looking to develop affordable homeownership opportunities for Black and African American residents who have been displaced from Northeast Portland, a lot of what was popping up in those conversations with the residents was just how kind of culturally important front porches, just one of many things that came up, but this was one that has stuck with me for decades at this point. And with that, there was a lot of dialogue in the residential infill project around placement. The feedback that I was giving, in which I've been pleased has kind of held in that code, is the opportunity to kind of that trade-off of what is considered quote unquote good design of having front doors facing a street versus the priority for this population was I'd rather have a front door that faces the side of the lot if that means I get a front porch and that I get a front door that I get to point to as my front door. And so I just want to bring that up as an example. Again, I'm not hearing direct conflicts to that in anything we're talking about, but it's just kind of a lens I like to bring into this space around contemplating what we, and I'm not saying all of us represent this, but I'm seeing a lot of photos and faces that do represent the white European design perspective in this space, myself included. I don't have my camera on because I'm in transit right now, but I just want to acknowledge that and just make sure we're being really conscious of that when we're talking about what we want to regulate and how.
I appreciate that, Julia. Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing up a couple of very specific elements that do have sort of cultural resonance and food for thought.
Well, and if I can build on that a little bit, I would agree that, I think in the first, I want to acknowledge that we're not going to, certainly the first draft's not going to get it right when it comes to that. Because, right, I think we should be aware of a lot of our perspective and biases that go into that. I do think this code represents a little bit of a pivot from past codes and how we think about zoning and development codes generally. Sorry, not zoning, but more development codes and how we regulate development generally, from something that is just on providing a reasonable set of design standards, say like, here's your cottage court and you have to have a door that faces the front place. And this is what we think, prescribe as what looks good, but also denies other opportunities for other community amenities and benefits that could serve folks. I think we're trying to more proactively think about development regulations as a series of trade-offs and incentives, and we can use those and craft those to incentivize public policy outcomes. That is something that we're we're trying. Certainly, it's the first time I've done that, so I want to be clear that like we're not going to get it right, and I think it's going to take a lot of iteration to get there. But I appreciate that perspective, and I'm going to I'll want to see that as we develop a first draft that I know will not totally hit the mark.
Thank you for that, Sean, and invite others to, I know there's been a couple of similar comments, but if others have specific experiences they can bring to the table on that front, all the better. Yeah, Kate.
Thanks. I just actually have a follow-up question to Julia's excellent point, which is that the more you all can kind of serve as a resource to sharing those kind of culturally specific preferences that we should be considering as part of this work to make sure we're not regulating those out of possibility, that would be super helpful. So any suggestions along those lines would be great.
Yeah, now is great. And also when that draft comes out, if you can sort of put that lens on or help us get that lens to the table, that would be even better. Other, yes, Mac.
Yeah, just thinking about some of the other sort of lessons learned that I've gotten from engaging with folks who are we're just, sorry, thinking about a specific project that I'm working on and that my agency has been working on other projects in the Southwest Corridor here in Portland and doing a lot of engagement preemptively with communities. And just to layer it in within that, it's a part of the metro area that has a large concentration of East African immigrants. And so just one of the key sort of design sort of elements that we heard a lot, which I mentioned earlier, but just to draw a through line through, was folks in that community tend to do a lot of high heat, oil spiced cooking. And so one of the really important things for them in trying to think about a home that would be really desirable to them is, again, that element of being able to have a window in the kitchen to air out different spices and the like, just to make sure it's not catching on their clothes was a piece that I heard a lot in some other advocacy as well. And just making sure that as we're contemplating zoning codes and development codes, that preserving the flexibility as much as possible to promote greater circulation within units, I think is also going to be really important just to make sure we can speak to just the different sorts of cultures that and cooking styles and methods that folks have throughout the state.
Great.
No, thank you for that. As somebody who cooks with a wok and has a fish burner outside, I appreciate that. Yeah.
Totally know what you're talking about there. Yep. Shannon.
Yeah, I guess I just have so many thoughts about this. And again, I'll try to be succinct. Those who've maybe heard or been around Habitat for Humanity for a long time, when I started 25 years ago, we were like, we built homes for people, not cars. No garages on a Habitat house. And we go to bat to not have garages. Then we started listening to the homeowners we serve and paying attention to like Oregon geography and weather realities. And like, if you went to those little cottages in Bend, you might have noticed they had a garage. And sometimes, you know, who we serve, right? A lot of single parent heads of households, usually 70% for any given affiliate. And like things that like do sound awesome conceptually, like in perfect world scenario for planning, like let's cluster all the parking like way over here and have people walk into their unit and have them like gracefully front one another. And it's like, if you were a single mom with 3 kids, like, do you want to have to put your groceries in a wagon? Like maybe not actually, right? So that idea of being like super people-centered, thank you, Julia, for raising that. And all of us, I'm gonna say, have learned over time and probably have more learning to do. That there's this I think many of us though, right, have been in this space and trying to actively listen for quite some time. It's why like I'm even another example to be concrete, right? We used to put like right in there, like, oh, you can't run a business in your home. Can't run a business in your home. Well, a lot of cultures, that's part of the whole purpose of buying a home. So you can have a side business. And even like childcare and how much we need childcare. And so like, whoa, you might find a couple habitat homes with some mini toilets. Like who knew? When you listen and learn and grow, right, over time. So for what it's worth, thanks.
You know, that last comment is actually building into our third question, which is like, the fact that we're going to iterate on things over time, right? Like obviously the legislature didn't direct us to develop like a live work module, right, as part of this code, but I do think that's important, especially from a perspective of like access to community amenities, right? Being able to use your home as a professional space, like that's an important part of that, right? And so maybe if we can, we do have a little bit of time here, Deb. I'm wondering if we can,
great.
Yeah, pivot a little bit into that third question. Let me paste that in the chat really fast.
Yeah, so the third question is really getting at the first two questions have been sort of, you know, what do we need right now to address the statutory requirements, policy objectives for the model code? Third question, what else would be great to include that maybe we don't have time for this year or the next 6 months, but could be iterated on or added on later to continue to improve the applicability and usefulness of the model code. And Sean added in the agenda a few examples. We talked about one earlier, land division module, street width design standard module, public works standards, affordable housing requirements, trees and landscaping, mandatory adjustments.
Yeah, and just to give some context for this,
Yeah,
like we
great.
know this is going to be a living, breathing document, right? And something that we're going to build on over time. Certainly the HAPO, right? We have this role with housing compliance, and part of our role is going to be developing models that folks can use to comply with housing laws. So I've included some examples of housing laws like, oh yeah, we have this piece on, you know, mandatory adjustments, right? In Senate Bill 1537. That's like a piece that we know is like an existing need for a module. Obviously, it's not part of the direction and funding that was provided in Senate Bill 1564, but we want to know like what these types of priorities are. I think we've heard a lot already in the discussion around like, you know, obviously live work, around, you know, housing mix and subdivision codes, things like that. But getting a sense of where we think the priorities are would help us direct our priorities as we get the office stood up.
Any ideas or additional ideas or thoughts about what else you think would really make this great for cities?
I could list some examples of things we've heard. We've certainly heard public facilities. We've certainly heard land division. We've certainly heard like live work. We've heard manufactured housing. We've heard permanent supportive housing. We've heard a number of things. So let's build on that.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead, Shannon.
Yeah, just quickly. And I know a lot of us are also like really giving this some deep thought right now because there's some different proposals on the table, but like if a for-profit builder or a nonprofit builder could just say like, oh, if I can find some similar property, ideally anywhere in Oregon or similarly sized communities in Oregon, I know I can build XYZ. Like I don't have to, of course, there will be site engineering. Like there's important site specific work to be done, but it's like, I could go build this same 24 home development, you know, in Burns or in Independence or in, you know, that would be like game changing, right? And for a state that's trying to stimulate development. Thanks.
Yeah, that kind of builds on Gust's comment of like the scaffolding of providing, yeah.
Just one more level that makes it that much easier. Anyone else have specific issues they've grappled with either as a developer builder or as a city staff or in between that you wish could be solved?
or just that you had something to refer to, so you don't need to like dig into other cities' codes, you know, to figure out how to regulate a particular thing
Yeah, I
related
think
to
this
housing.
came up previously, is that a lot of the delays in improving housing don't come from land use review. They come from, you know, the building code or engineering or public works, et cetera. And related to that is, you know, we're thinking about like a model land use code, but it really should be tied to like a model fire code, a model building code, and other elements that are supportive in the ecosystem. For instance, you know, the existing building code treats a 2 to 4 unit building the same as a skyscraper and says that you have to have the same fire alarm and sprinkler provisions in both types of buildings. That's clearly inappropriate. You know, there's actually a type of fire sprinkler that was developed for that type of building, the 13R, which you can flush to a toilet and doesn't require a big building grade fire alarm system. So you can cut your costs per unit to roughly 25% using that type of fire sprinkler. Like, we should just say that's the type of fire sprinkler for all types of residential buildings of 4 units or less. And also make sure that single family homes and ADUs have to install them because they're so cheap you can install them for $7,000 a unit. Why have we allowed the realtors to convince us that certain types of houses, their residents are expendable and we don't need to provide them with fire protection, but other types of houses, we need to spend more per unit to protect those residents with fire sprinklers? Like, I don't understand why certain types of houses it's legal to even bring them in market without fire sprinklers, but the realtors have managed to get that loophole in and to get Oregon to reject that portion of the International Residential Code that requires fire sprinklers in all new residences. So I'm suggesting that we should bring our fire codes in the 21st century. We should right size them. We should link them to our land use codes. And there's also other elements of the fire code that relate to how fire trucks get to buildings or how you fight fires that also can get in the way of us meeting like our pedestrian accessibility goals for walkable communities that we should also look at. So I just want to elevate that there's a lot more codes that can get in the way. Elevator codes are also something we should unpack.
Good one. Yes, I know elevators have come up before, I think, and residential style elevators. I think Alan brings that up frequently. So, Cassidy.
Hi, apologies for being late today. So I missed sort of the first half. But I guess I would reiterate what Garland was starting to talk about, which is, you know, a lot of the obstacles tend to be like most people can read a code, a zoning code, and kind of understand or get to like, how many units do I think I can build here when I'm just looking at a piece of land, checking the zoning. But it's when you get into the discretionary processes that you may be unfamiliar with in a jurisdiction you're unfamiliar with, that's the uncertainty. And then when you get into infrastructure, right away, utilities, those kinds of things. So an example would be, you know, recently in Portland, which is mostly PGE has been saying we need larger Class A vaults, which are these gargantuan concrete things. And the city of Portland says it's got to be on your property, and you must build to the property line. So now we're building in our basements humongous concrete vaults to satisfy the utility in an expensive location that's required by the jurisdiction. And then we add the EV charging and those get bigger. So I don't mean to just start, but those are just some examples of things that are coordination things that you often don't know, you know, you can't assess, you know, at your pre-development analysis stage. So once you get to know a jurisdiction, you might know those landmines because they burned you in the past, but trying to bring more people to come and invest and create all types of housing, those kinds of uncertainties start to be lists of things of the, oh, I think there's some uncertainty there. I'm not quite sure what my risk, my entitlement risk is, or my jurisdictional risk is. So I don't know how this process gets away from that and what Sean's working on, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, those are really important ones, Cassidy, because those are where those real barriers to additional or sort of amped up production come from, that uncertainty that's left out there.
Yeah, and I'll add there's kind of two underlying elements of that. One is like you pointed out, other elements of code that aren't land use code that impact that, like public facilities, that type of thing. There's also the discrepancy in terms of practice, right? We're talking about words that are written on a page versus when you actually get into the brass tacks of the development process, it looks different, right? So how do you account for that? I mean, I do think part of the role of our office is to be more engaged in that practice, like practice overall, like as it relates to development. But I do think you're right that it's going to take time to figure that out, right? And to figure out like where does it make sense to ensure that we kind of develop more consistent processes and practices to encourage the development of housing and reduce the landmines. I think it's going to be difficult, right? Because we have different rules in different local jurisdictions and different practices, different cultures, that type of thing. Yeah, it's a wicked problem. I'll put it that way.
And maybe some of those, maybe one solution there, Sean, and others, I'd be curious, is, a module that doesn't necessarily solve all those problems, but offers some guidance for cities for how to communicate what all the different pieces are, including those discretionary processes that are outside the land use review, just so you know upfront what you're working with. It's not unheard of. I've been there walking into a permit meeting and having some secret code provision you didn't know about presented to you on paper. Yeah.
Yeah, Deb, I just want to jump in and say I think that's a great idea. If we could help jurisdictions have like just a one pager of like, by the way, read our zoning code, but here's some other things you need to be sure you're checking. I think City of Portland, we used to do pre-apps a lot. You'd sit down and they'd bring all the relevant bureaus in and you could have a meeting at the jump to say like, okay, what else do I need to be worrying about here that's not really clear or easy for me to find, but the people doing this work every day can tell me. So getting, cities and towns of various sizes, make sure, hey, here's things you need to know about coming to develop in our community would be very helpful to people.
That's great. Thank you, Cassidy. Anything? Oh, Julia, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that as a example from a city in Oregon that I've seen. I'm pausing because I think it was, I think it was Grants Pass. It might have been Medford, so I apologize. I can't give a specific kudos, but I know that they had worked on a guide and do like a regular newsletter or something like that goes out to developers to essentially kind of flag certain parts of the code that are either new or just to kind of make it easier to utilize certain parts of the code. So I'm thinking again, like, I don't know, as an affordable housing developer walking in and like having to dig through like 5 different sections of code to try and find all the things that I can leverage as an affordable housing developer. It'd be great if it was just kind of standard that cities had like a cheat sheet and like, this is what you reference. And I'd also note that would be great for the state to have as well for affordable housing developers to reference in a really easy single place, so that we can, as needed, which is hopefully rare, but as needed, leverage that aspect of HAPO in terms of kind of referencing back what is missing where it shouldn't be.
I'll just say one of my long-term dreams for the office is to have a housing wiki. A place where we can have a lot of information warehoused around like, different state laws, that type of thing, but totally understood.
Awesome. Thank you. And seeing some support for that. Well, let's shift into wrapping up the conversation. Had some additional concepts and ideas put on the table, had a further discussion about what form-based code could or couldn't be, at least in this context of the model code right now, and had some really helpful discussion about how we think about and bring the housing needs of people from different cultures into the model code, and just sort of what to be aware of. I think in some cases it's not so much what we're putting in the code, but just making sure we're not preventing certain uses that are important for different cultures to be built. So we'll keep picking away at that. Are there other thoughts HOG members have about our discussion today? Generally, was this a good format? It's similar to our prior format. But any reflections on the meeting and discussion today? And especially just want to check in on our racial equity framework and the items Sean presented at the beginning about historical inequities, benefits and burdens, and accountability. Did we get at those today? Where could we have improved? Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I think this is the answering sort of one of your first questions there. But one item that I have been thinking about, and I know I've mentioned this space again, but just for contemplation within the model code, and there being some additional flexibility for affordable housing when it comes to minimum densities. Codes right now, of course, is minimum units, but I, for example, had a project in Southwest Portland that we're still bringing forward. We were awarded the site and then shortly thereafter upzoned, and as a result of that upzone, we had to add an additional floor to the building. However, that caused an issue in sort of what our unit mix was at application. At application, our unit mix was over 50% 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. As a result of now having a higher density and needing to add an additional floor, that ratio of family-sized units had to drop below 50% just due to site constraints, zoning, building codes, all the different things. And so one of the things that I would encourage the state to kind of really explore is a minimum bedroom density instead for regulated affordable housing. I could give greater, if not equal, if not greater density on a site with a fewer number of units versus a 96 unit studio building, which would have been permissed outright via code. And so that's just one of the things I kind of want to throw out there. If there are still concerns with a lower unit count but higher density in terms of occupancy in the affordable housing world, most projects are using the LIHTC program, and LIHTC comes with built-in occupancy requirements. So you as a person who qualifies for a 60% AMI unit, you cannot get a 3-bedroom 60% AMI unit as a single person. You need a household size to qualify for it. And so I just mentioned that as there is sort of a backstop external that doesn't need to be in code to make sure that those units are fulfilling the density, which was the goal of the code in the first place, but still provides that flexibility for affordable housing developers to create buildings and unit mixes that are responsive to community needs and get those more projects to pencil like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Totally. Yeah. We've been thinking a lot about like unit size, diversity, bedroom count as one of the kind of outcomes that we're trying to shoot for, and how we get there. I think is going to be an important, we'll have to iterate, right? So,
yeah, I'm being mindful of where those other regulations are on those things. Appreciate that. Any last comments or especially thoughts? I don't know, Sean, if you had anything, and I'm going to just put you on the spot now, had anything in mind when you were thinking about the racial equity framework, historical inequities, benefits and burdens, and accountability that you didn't necessarily hear about today that maybe we should be digging into in the future?
Yeah, no, I mean, if I'm thinking about the kind of goals of this meeting, and especially in the context of the racial equity framework, I think we had a series of really good and thoughtful discussion around a lot of the benefits and burdens in the context of like development codes in the United States sitting in a context of racial and economic segregation. Certainly a lot of really interesting back and forth. I don't want to say that like we've solved it, right? More that we're grappling with it, and we know that it's going to take time and iteration to get it right. But I do think this conversation really exemplified a lot of that. I thought folks were really bringing that into the discussion. So thank you, everybody. This is just what I want to say.
All right.
Thanks. I want to just highlight that I think a lot of the complexity of this work, it revolves around trying to tie yourself into knots and then slightly untie them in order of like, hey, how can we accommodate diversity, but also not really touch anything of our existing code? And so like front porches, for instance, aren't usually required by our existing codes. In Oregon, there is a slight exception with community design standards in City of Portland for a few years, but that went away. But front porches are something that like everyone loves, actually. And the main problem with front porches is that sometimes they need to impede into the front setback. Well, is that a problem with like racial equity or diversity, or is that a problem with us not being able to let go of the front setback as something that just needs to not be enforced if we want to allow for more equitable outcomes? Another thing, if you want racial equity and diversity and access to opportunity, is you need to allow for commercial activities in residential zones. If you go around the world, people are selling stuff out of their houses. That's illegal in most places in Oregon because of racism, because we actually don't want to have those people conducting those activities in residential zones. Like, it's just part of that lens. And so we're going to tie ourselves into knots. We try and comply with like front setbacks and stuff like that are elements of this past paradigm that are just holding us back. We need to, as much as possible, let go of those things so we can more fully embrace our charges of facilitating racial diversity, for instance.
Thanks, Garland. Good insights and good food for us to keep chewing on. Julie, I'm going to hand it to you, and then I'm going to wrap us up here.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly, in terms of the question of format of the meeting and everything, just wanted to say thank you for the really thorough and well-presented materials. As someone who's not quite as familiar with every single existing model code that the state has produced, I really appreciated the background as well as the just kind of build up then to contextualize that so we could have a productive conversation. So I just wanted to acknowledge the work that went into that, and that was very helpful. So thanks.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, I know the team put a lot of work into that, and has been this will really help sort of ground you all for the next iteration that comes along, and sort of co-creating this as we move along here. Sean, any last thoughts before I adjourn?
I do. One second.
Oh, I'm sorry. You had some next steps.
Yeah, just to give folks a
Thank
sense
you.
on timing. Yeah, let me just share my screen really quickly. I just pulled up the slide. Just to give folks a sense of timeline. So obviously today's discussion, right, was kind of like we took a look at the recipe. We've talked a lot about the parameters of the dish, what ingredients to include, how we prepare those ingredients, all that good stuff. We have, again, that detailed questionnaire that's going to be open until the end of the day, March 12th. I'll also note, we did receive one note on like a technical issue that happened. So if you would like to provide feedback via like an email or a document, that's also fine too. We just did this as a format that like is easy to like fill out and keep apprised of. I did try to address some of those technical issues to hopefully prevent that from happening in the future. But if you have problems, let me know. I can share the questions with you in a PDF format, and you're welcome to submit just a document to us. Over the next couple of months, our chefs are going to be hard at work working on the recipe and refining it for delivery back to us. We're going to meet again on June 18th. I'm actually going to be remoting into that meeting. I'll be in Utah for a wedding, but we'll be able to kind of review and kind of talk through the draft code and be able to refine it. It's the first iteration of the document. We know there's parts of it they're going to need refinement over time. And then June 30th, that's actually the end of where our contract ends. We need an amendment to kind of ensure that we can carry on the work into the next year. But as we do that, we'll be getting into refinement over the later half of the year. That'll include opportunities to kind of broadly distribute and get feedback on the model code with all of your colleagues and networks. Of course, please feel free to communicate and bring forward their ideas to this space as members of the work group. And we'll be shooting for adoption in December to meet our January 1st deadline for the model code. So more to come. We'll have more details in the second half of the year as we kind of get into that work plan. But thank you guys again for all your thoughts, and we'll be hard at work over the next couple of months producing an initial draft. And thank you, Kathy and Kate, for being here and taking on a lot of this work.
I like the rocket ships. Excellent.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Thank you all so much.
Bye
See you
for now.
soon.
I just have one thing for staff as just like a technical note. I just wanted to flag that for some reason I didn't end up receiving the meeting packet for this week. I checked my spam filter. It didn't go through that. I just got it because I reached out to another member and I was like, I haven't seen a packet yet. And it's like the afternoon the day before. So I just wanted to flag that. I don't know if other folks are experiencing that issue too. Hopefully not, but
We'll double check the distribution, Mac. Thank you.
yeah,
I actually did. If anybody else experienced that problem, let us know because I did BCC it to everybody that's on our list. And if you didn't get it, I definitely want to know about that.
I think I also, apologies, I've been traveling this week, so things have been a little frenetic, but I don't think I got it either.
Okay, we'll double check our BCC list, but and
Figure out
try to
what's
figure out what's going on.
Sorry, you all. Thank you for persevering nonetheless and being here.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Great. All right. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.